First Meetings and Rhetorical Questions, a Marvel fanfiction written on AO3 by Oreo Cookie. Peter walked inside to find Tony frickin' Stark sitting on the couch with Aunt May. Peter, she gasped. Mr. Stark tells me you signed up for a grant and got accepted. Okay, well, that was definitely not true. He had more than enough to do, what with Spider-Man and schoolwork and the ACTEC team. Plus, why was Mr. Stark in his apartment? He didn't know how the eccentric billionaires who moonlighted as metal superheroes worked, but he was fairly sure that they didn't come into their future interns' homes and chat with their aunts. Oh wait, the guy was talking. Yep, September Foundation, huh, Pete? Peter was unimaginably confused. But the only thing he and Mr. Stark had in common was being superheroes, and if that was why Mr. Stark was here, then it was easier to just nod and play along. I've been hearing a lot about you, Peter. Mind if we step somewhere to chat? It was a kind of embarrassing, world-leading superhero billionaire Stark stepping into his messy bedroom, but the apartment was so small and Aunt May would absolutely eavesdrop if they went anywhere else. So, Pete, Mr. Stark began as they stepped into Peter's bedroom. Know why I'm here? Feeling like a child in the principal's office, Peter shook his head no. It was a lie. He kind of sort of maybe had an idea, but he couldn't put it into words, and good enough for Tony frickin' Stark. You're a quiet one, kid. A starstruck or just nerves? And that was what snapped Peter out of his stunned state. Neither, he signed, making two peace signs into a right angle and drumming the fingers of his right hand against the tips of his left. Mr. Stark's eyebrows furrowed, then sprang in recognition. Oh, crud. ASL. Sorry, it's been a while since I've hung around Clint. Can you know, he tapped his ear. Peter nodded, snagging a random notebook and pencil from his desk. He flipped it open to a page, writing, Sorry, I can't talk. Hey, it's okay. How come? Peter gave him a look, the one he learned from Michelle and Ned whenever anyone was too loud at lunch. Mr. Stark backed off immediately. Whoa, okay, never mind. Let's get back to business. Peter nodded. Mr. Stark pulled out his phone, typing something into it as a hologram appeared. This is you, right? The hologram showed Spider-Man swinging around Queens. It wasn't really a question, rhetorical if anything, but Peter still tried valiantly to deny it, fiercely shaking his head no. Yeah, Mr. Stark said patiently. The hologram turned to CCTV footage of Spider-Man, stopping a speeding car. Peter winced internally. Look at you go, Mr. Stark marveled. 30 pounds. Nice catch. He sounded proud, something Peter certainly wasn't expecting. He sounded a bit like Ben. That brought back a whole flood of memories, of birthdays and trips to the park, and of a cold, dark street painted red. But Peter shoved it down. He was getting very good at that. It's not me, he signed. I'm just a kid from Queens. Peter, Mrs. Stark said apologetically. I really can't understand you yet. Think you might be able to use the paper? Sorry, he scribbled, still shaking his head. A force of habit. It's really not me, Mr. Stark. That's the one on YouTube, right? It's probably all fake. Mr. Stark hummed. Peter looked up from the notebook. Mr. Stark had maneuvered himself around the room and picked up the yardstick, poking it against the ceiling of the trapdoor where Peter just managed to fling the notebook and jump up from the bed, tackling his suit and shoving it lightly into the open closet door. So, Mr. Stark said. Peter looked back up at him. You're the Spiderling? A crime-fighting spider boy? The aforementioned Spiderling collapsed back onto his bed, picking up the notebook and pencil. I'm Spider-Man, he wrote resignedly. Mr. Stark leaned out the notebook to read. Not in that onesie you're not, he scoffed. Not a onesie, Peter wrote, but Mr. Stark didn't correct himself. He grabbed his suit from Peter's closet, and this time Peter didn't try to stop him. Who knows? Anybody? No, nobody, he said, tempted to write a foreign concept to you, but because of the whole I'm Spider-Man thing, he didn't. Not even your unusually attractive aunt? Peter gave him a look of disgust, but wrote, Are you kidding me? She'd freak out. You know what I think is really cool? Mr. Stark said, barreling through topics like a freight train, barely looking at Peter's notebook. This webbing. He hurled it at Peter, who caught it without looking up. The tactile strength is off the charts. Who manufactured that? Me, he wrote in big letters, turning over the notebook to show Mr. Stark, who was sitting a couple feet away, picking through Peter's homemade suit. He scooted a little closer, so he could read over Peter's shoulder, who still poked and prod at his suit. And climbing walls, how are you doing that? Adhesive gloves, or... A long story, that's me as well. Peter began to write more, but Mr. Stark held something up. Lordy, he gasped, peering through Peter's goggles. Can you even see through these? Peter yanked the goggles away from Mr. Stark, and then scrawled, Yes, I can, on the paper. How? Whatever happens, whenever it happens, it's like my senses got dialed up to 11. They help me focus, Peter wrote on the page. Mrs. Stark looked up at the suit, then looked at the room, then looked at Peter. You're in a dire need of an upgrade, he said simply. Systematic, top to bottom, 100% restoration. That's why I'm here. Peter sat back, too fast mind failing him. Mr. Stark kept talking. Why do you do this? I gotta know. What's your MO? What gets you out of that twin bed in the morning? Gasping feebly for thought, anything to answer Mr. Stark, Peter wrote, Because I've been me my whole life, and I've had these powers for 6 months. Mr. Stark read it and gave Peter a confused glance, so he kept writing. I read books, and I build computers, and yeah, I'd love to play football, but I couldn't then, and shouldn't now. Sure, Mr. Stark said, because you're different, but I couldn't tell any of that, so I'm not. Peter swallowed, then continued scratching on paper. When you can do the things I can, but you don't, and then bad things happen? Mr. Stark leaned in closer. They happened because of you. Peter finally finished writing. And Peter could see it now, the way Mr. Stark's face dropped. He knew the lesson all too well, it seemed. But as soon as the sullen, heartbroken look Mr. Stark's face appeared, it was gone. So, you want to do your part, right? Look out for the little guy, make the world a better place and all? Peter nodded. Tony Stark turned, lifting a hand to what had to be the most awkward pat on the back ever. Got a passport? Baffled, Peter shook his head. You ever been to Germany? Another no. Oh, you'll love it. Peter fumbled for the pencil again. I can't go to Germany. Why? Mr. Stark sounded genuinely confused, like he didn't understand why someone would not be able to just drop everything and go to Germany. Then again, he probably didn't. Peter floundered for an excuse, and unfortunately accidentally picked up the one he used on Ned whenever he had patrol. I've got homework to do. Mr. Stark stood up. I'm gonna pretend you didn't just write that. He moved over to the door, talking the whole way. Might be a bit dangerous. Better tell Aunt Holly I'm taking you. He stopped, hand grabbing the wedding of the doorknob. Peter leapt up and shot from his wedge shooters. Don't tell Aunt May, he wrote. Mr. Stark looked mildly aggravated, but somewhat impressed. All right, Spider-Man, he said, after reading Peter's hastily scrawled message. He pulled at the webbing, but it stuck fast. Can you... Sorry, Peter signed, then sped off to get the dissolvent.